No worries, man. This is par for the course, you know. Well, and they keep changing everything now too. With the link, is that this is par for the course. Oh, you can hear me on the feed.
Let it burn, some shivers up and down your You hold them all in your see a smile, the brightest note you've ever known. In the ditch, found your path, climbing still, the wreckage all around your dreams. Grass is green where they lay, in the sun, the skin feed another day. Rode it out, made a breath, force the words, something that your eyes can't see.
To our digital presentation of our monthly speaker series. First, I want to thank Lincoln's Beard for letting us play some of their new music. So they have a great new album that will be out on digital and vinyl. And the single titled Elk Hunter was released last week for free on SoundCloud. And the new album will be called Young Blood. So check that out. And for their past albums, you can also look on any streaming service for that. So we want to thank Lincoln's Beard for being that intro music that you heard to this. So nice local band here. And then also tonight, we're still supporting the Kiggins. So in the comments, you will be able to see a link to our Support the Kiggins Fund. Tonight was supposed to be at the Kiggins Theater, and we're not able to do that. So we're actually broadcasting from my home. So please, please help support the Kiggins through that link. And if you don't find the link in the comments during the time, we'll also repost it after the talk with the link on our page. So keep an eye out for that and definitely help out the Kiggins Theater. So our talk here tonight is just one of multiple commemorations of the 40th anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And here we're going to explore the history both before, during, and after this really important event for Southwest Washington. And we're really excited to have you tonight join us digitally for this talk. And as a historian, I am very excited to be able to share this with you. And so first, as you can see here, we want to thank our generous sponsor, Wager Audio. Without Wager Audio, we would not be able to do this digital feed at the level that we're doing right now. It absolutely would not be possible. And also, if you need assistance during this time with digital communications, with events, audio, bands, anything like that on this time, you definitely need to reach out to Wager Audio and do that. They're a great crew. They're a local business, and they have done a ton for us at the museum. We also want to thank, as you can see here in the next slide, we want to thank the Historic Preservation Commission. Their support year in and year out has been vital to make our speaker series happen, and these programs wouldn't be possible without them. And this year, their support alone is allowing us to bring these talks to you digitally and free of charge. So now, before we get started with the talk, I want to tell you a little bit about the exhibits that we have here at the museum. Even though we're not open right now, you'll be able to come back in and eventually visit us. And so we still have exhibits up. So you see right here our History of Brewing, which is in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of Prohibition being enacted. In History of Brewing, it showcases the history of beer, liquor, prohibition in Clark County, and we use that interpretive panels that explore topics such as, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Vancouver Barracks. We talk about the era of prohibition, which is a quite interesting part to talk about. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the establishment and growth of Great Western Malting, which is still a consistent business in our community, Lucky Lager. And then we also talk about our local brewery scene that we have today. And we want to say a special thanks to our exhibit sponsors. And so you can see right here, Great Western Malting is a big sponsor of our exhibit. We also had Barlow's Public House, which jumped in and helped sponsor our exhibit. And then Bader Beer and Wine Supply, Steve Bader and Bader Beer and Wine Supply has been a long standing supporter of the museum. And then now you can see we are going to have an exhibit open in August called Her Story, which is Founders, Leaders, and Visionaries. So you can check that out when we're able to get back in the museum and open that up. And then also we have open when we're back, Music, Movement, and Sound. You see an exhibit that's exploring Clark County's musical roots. And then lastly here, you can see we have Currents of Progress, which is our ports exhibit, which explores Clark County rivers, roads, and ports. So please come and see us when we can open up again. So I want to welcome you to tonight's talk. And as you can see here, we are talking about Mount St. Helens 40 years later. And in this talk, we're going to look at the story of Mount St. Helens, what we were able to pull out before 1980, and actually talk about that, which is really nice. In addition, we were able to get the insight of two journalists that lived through that day. They were kind enough to record some interviews with us. And then we're going to talk about the narrative that's developed afterwards and also how it's impacted the museum's collection. However, before we get started, we have a special message from Ray, the Executive Director at the Mount St. Helens Institute. So please welcome Ray and enjoy this video.
Hello, Ray Yerkowitz here, Executive Director of the Mount St. Helens Institute. This is an important year in the history of Mount St. Helens. It's an opportunity to look back at what Mount St. Helens has meant to people for eons. It's an opportunity to look back at what happened in 1980 and how that's changed people's lives. It's an opportunity to think about how Mount St. Helens has been reborn since 1980 into an incredibly diverse and important landscape. It's also an opportunity to think about what does it mean in the future to us all? How do we connect with this place? Especially in a time when we can't connect with it. Unfortunately, we had so many plans, all of us, for this 40th eruptiversary, and they've been stymied by this virus, which is unfortunate, but folks like Clark County Historical Museum and Mount St. Helens Institute are doing our best to meet people where you're at, which is here online. It's also been a challenging time for organizations like us, right? I mean, everything we had planned has been disrupted, and for the lucky ones of us, we've been able to retool our programming and still connect with people. So tonight is an opportunity to support organizations like the Clark County Historical Museum, small businesses like the Kiggins Theater, all of these organizations that support our community. So I hope you'll step up and do that. And please, when the coast is more clear than it is now and everything's safe, I hope you come up to Mount St. Helens and get to experience the past, the present, and future of this incredibly dynamic landscape. Enjoy these amazing presentations tonight, and I look forward to seeing you up on the volcano soon. Take care.
So welcome back, and we're really thankful that Ray was able to provide that video for us. And so now let's get into our talk. So thinking about this 40th anniversary, we realize sometimes life can change in a single instant. We're living through that moment right now. And on May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens, the sparkling gem within the Cascade Range, it erupted with a level of violence that few had expected. And within moments, lives were lost, dreams were destroyed, and this verdant forest was just completely leveled. And people around the world understood and saw this impact of this eruption. And now the mountain reported to be a photo of Mount St. Helens from the eruption on May 18th, 1980. And this is believed to be from the Chalachi Valley, or Chalachi Prairie, as we call it. And we think it was taken by Hermine Decker-Duthie. And just the power and massive nature of this event is just in crisp detail that we see right here. However, what is the story before this moment of fire and violence and destruction? What is the tale told before that? And so sources, note that Mount St. Helens, the volcanic system, started erupting only about 40,000 years ago, and they state that it makes it the youngest of the 5 steep sloped volcanoes in the Cascade Range. And over millennia, sustained periods of magmatic activity have produced a series of lava domes. And it's posited that most of the volcano visible today was built from eruptions roughly about 4,000 years ago. And this makes it one of the most active volcanoes in the Cascades. Now, another thing that sources indicate is that about 3,600 years ago, an eruption occurred that was roughly 4 times as large as the May 18th event. And that's just incredible to think. And so this mountain has, for as long as people have been around, been present in their minds, and they've known for it for a long, long time. Now, in the mountain's nomination for the National Register of Historic Places, it's actually said that the Cowlitz name for the mountain, and please forgive me, I'm trying to pronounce this, is Lawatala, which roughly translates to the smoker. And this name, it identifies the eruptive nature and character of how people have viewed this. And actually, we can see right here in this image that today, the name that it's referred to, obviously Mount St. Helens is one, but it also gets referred to as Lewitt, and that's attached to it. And the origin of the word Lewitt is likely believed to have come from the longer name given to the mountain by the people that lived nearby it. And so knowledge of the mountain and its creation and its behavior has been passed down by generations of Cowlitz and Yakima and other people of both Southwest Washington and of Washington State through oral traditions and their histories. And so Lewitt is one of the first landforms features that is created by Spilier, or Coyote, and it's a figure of the creation story that's passed down by our Southwest Washington nations. Now, other histories, they, inform of the nature and the relationship between nature and people, of the environment, and of the sacred nature of the mountain. And it tells how Lewitt was also imbued with spiritual power. And this is a really fascinating history because this history is of central importance to Southwest Washington nation's spiritual beliefs. And so there is different variations in the story, but I'm gonna tell you one that I was able to look and identify through the Oregon State University. And this one talks of long ago, there was a huge landslide of rock that just roared to the Columbia River near the Cascades. And eventually it formed a natural stone bridge that spanned the river. And the bridge came to be called the Bridge of the Gods. And that's, what we know of today. And in the center of the arch burned the only fire in the world, and making this place sacred to the Native American nations. And people would travel from north, south, west, east to get embers from this sacred fire to then ignite fires in their own community. And an old woman, Lewitt, which the full name sometimes translates to Lady of Fire, lived in the center of the arch tending to this sacred fire. And Lewitt, as she was called, was so faithful in her task and so kind to the people of the nations who came for the fire that she was noticed by the great chief, and I'm going to try to pronounce, Tai Saleh, and he decided to offer a gift to Lewitt. And this gift that he bestowed to Lewitt was eternal life. And because Lewitt, and as soon as this happened, Lewitt began to weep because she did not want to live as an old woman forever. And so the chief said that he could not take back the gift, but he told Lewitt that he could grant her one wish. And she ended up having the wish that she wanted to be young and beautiful. And so he did end up giving her this gift. And her beauty was famed and it was known widely. And one day, Wais came from the land of the Multnomas in the south to see Lewitt. And just as he arrived to the Bridge of the Gods, his brother Klickitat just came crashing, thundering down from the north. And both of these brothers ended up falling in love with Lewitt, but she couldn't decide between either of these brothers. And so Klickitat and Y East had a tremendous fight, and villages were burned and forests were destroyed and they disappeared in the flames. And the chief watched all of this in fury, and it just infuriated him. And he ended up, from what's said, destroying the bridge of the gods, and it fell into the river. And he ended up punishing the three lovers. However, even when he was punishing them, he still had love for them. So where each of these lovers fell, he raised up a mighty mountain. And because Lewitt was beautiful, her mountain, St. Helens, had a symmetrical cone with a dazzling white cap of snow. And then Y East mountain, which is Mount Hood, still, lifts up his head in pride and is a strong individual. And then Klickitat was, even rough in his ways, still had a tender heart. And as Mount Adams bends his head in sorrow, weeping to see the beautiful love Lewitt wrapped in snow. And there are variations. This is obviously not the only version of this history, but there are various variations. So obviously it was at the attention of the Native American nations, this mountain, but it also captured the attention of European travelers, took notice to it. And records indicate that in the late 1790s, Captain George Vancouver, and you can see a picture of him right here, sighted and named the volcano. And it's said that he named it after the British ambassador to Spain, Aline Fitzherbert, also known as Baron St. Helens. And we can see it here when it's indicated as a picture of him. So beyond just them seeing this, there was also early documentation of European travelers seeing activity at the mountain. One record that was noted was from December 5th, 1842, and there's a couple things that talk about this on the specific date, that there was a great eruption of Mount St. Helens. And this here you see is what's believed to be an artistic depiction of that mountain, of that eruption. And this was the first eruption in the series that extended for many, many months. And sources, from what I looked at, indicate that the 1800s were a pretty active period, and there's varying, accounts on when the timing of things were happening, but it was. And it seems that this lasted, from some assessments, from about 1831 to 1857, and then finally the mountain quieted. It would quiet for over 100 years at this point. And this is buttressed by notes from explorers between the 1840s and 1850s who reported eruptions from Mount St. Helens also. However, one of the neat things that we're able to find while doing this project was in the museum's collection, we have the Vancouver Independent, and we actually found a newspaper account here from June 20th, 1888. And it reads, the postmaster at Cowlitz reports that Mount St. Helens is smoking. A grayish smoke or steam can be plainly seen issuing from the south side near the summit. And we can see that actual clip of that article right here that we pulled for you. However, to date, we haven't found any other record of this specific activity and if it was more extensive. So it's really interesting to hear about this kind of 19th century activity when it came to the volcanic activity. But now, concerning non-volcanic activity in the late 19th century, most of what we know is about general recreation. And then there was some references to resource extraction during this time. We found articles from 1886. There was a July 1886 one that talked about a Mr. Sumner Lockwood with 6 companions and 3 horses that left Le Centre to set out for Spirit Lake and with the intention to climb Mount St. Helens. And then there were a number of articles in the 1880s noting ascents of the summit of Mount St. Helens. For example, on April 8th, 1888, the article from the Oregonian, which we can pictured right here, you can see that it's just a small portion of it, provides a almost travel log of a Mr. W.B. Gilbert's discussing his trip and ascent up Mount St. Helens. And there are a handful of these types of articles that we pulled from the Oregonian and were able to find of these kind of trips to Spirit Lake and the attempts to that. Now, it also appears that there was also mining activity up on Mount St. Helens in the late 19th century. Here we see, if you take a look here, there's an Oregonian article from July 3rd, 1897. And again, that's pictured here. You can see a portion of it. And it notes that this district, which is called the Mount St. Helens district, lies in and around the vicinity of Mount St. Helens. And it further indicated that there were 500 locations in that district that were extracting material, and that work to that extent was about $10,000 had been done upon those claims, and that the ore that was coming out was getting about $100 per ton. And so that's a lot of what we found in the 19th century. But now in the 20th century, there's a bit of a different history. It was still focused on recreation. And Spirit Lake was a very popular tourist spot for decades prior to the eruption. And there were 6 camps on the shore of Spirit Lake. There was a Boy Scout camp. There was a Girl Scout camp. There were 2 YMCA camps. And then there was one from local and one from Portland. There was a Harmony Falls Lodge. And then there were also other camps for general public and places for them to recreate. Additionally, there were lodges, like I said, including the Spirit Lake Lodge and then the Mount St. Helens Lodge, which was later owned by Harry R. Truman, which many people are aware of. And one article, which is pictured right here, it actually notes the history of that YMCA camp, which goes back to 1909 up there. And then that camp grew from there. And we actually saw articles about all the way into the 20s. And here's that article you can see detailing it. And then into the mid 20th century, Mount St. Helens was promoted as a destination. Here we actually see, this is a really cool one we pulled from the Oregonian that you can see that has an advertisement for Mount St. Helens. Now, obviously, one of the most famed characters of Mount St. Helens was Mr. Harry Truman. Truman owned and operated the Mount St. Helens Lodge at Spirit Lake. Here we actually see a photo from the University of Washington, which shows the sign for his lodge around the 1950s. It's a really cool picture. And Truman was born in West Virginia in October of 1896. And Truman's family actually moved west to Washington State, where they settled about 160 acres on farmland in the eastern portion of Lewis County. And it said he attended high school at Mossy Rock, and then he enlisted in the Army as a private in 1917. And it said that he actually served in France during World War I. And at some point, he eventually returned back, had some other sojourns, and then came to Chehalis, where he ran an automotive and service and gasoline station for a period of time. And some records say he eventually just got tired of people and civilization and decided to lease 50 acres overlooking Spirit Lake in what was, the wilderness of Mount St. Helens. And he settled there at the foot of the mountain, and it said that he opened up a gas station and a grocery store. And he eventually opened the Mount St. Helens Lodge close to the outlet of Spirit Lake, which it said he operated that for 50 plus years. And here's a neat photo. I mean, many people have probably seen photos of Harry Truman before, so here's one of him later in life that more recognizable. And in the Mount St. Helens area, Truman was known for his curious behavior. Tales were spun that he supposedly one day helped a forest ranger imbibe a little too much, so that he ended up becoming drunk, and he could burn a pile of brush or do something that he wanted to do. Says he also hunted illegally, even wearing a fake game warden badge, and that he also stole gravel from the National Park Service. So Truman operated for many years, and it said that when his wife Edna died, that he ended up closing the lodge mostly and only rented like a handful of boats and cabins during the summer. And so it's kind of the period leading up. Now, obviously, we want to talk about the day that changed everything. And there's some sources that indicate that as early as the 1970s, the mountain did start to gain attention for its volcanic activity. Now, I want to say something real quick about the next set of images that I'm going to show you. These are, I'm going to credit the Longview's, the Daily News. Andre, who I interviewed, actually is from that. And they have a really, really great timeline on their website, which is really powerful. And so I was able to actually utilize some of the images from that. And also the sources that I'm going to cite in this come from the Daily News, the Columbian, the Seattle Times, the Tacoma Tribune, and the Oregonian. So much of what I talk about is both a sourced information and then some quotes from these publications that they provided. So this is kind of how I was able to get the resources to do this talk tonight. So first here we see an image from the Daily News, was what I was talking about. So it was in March of 1980 that a magnitude 4.1 earthquake, it signaled the reawakening, really, of Mount St. Helens. An eruption of ash and steam, opened up a 250-foot crater during that month. The mountain would have numerous earthquakes. And, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake just north of the summit did trigger some avalanches on the mountain. And so, it was around that March time that it started to have activity. And so at this time, it really drew attention. So seismologists decided to deploy sensors along the mountain to keep a closer eye on that activity. And over time, the earthquakes would increase in number and they would increase in strength. So on March 24th, 1980, and again, here's another image from around that time from the Daily News. On that day, it's noted that there was as many as 20 earthquakes per hour that were recorded. And seismologists and the U.S. FS officials, they began to ask people to stay away from Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens around this time. And flights over the mountain, they would go and they'd kind of look. It didn't show any unusual features except for, the numerous tracks of earthquake-triggered snow avalanches that were being triggered by this. So the very next day, and again, here now we see another image from the Daily News with the crater. It was the next day that it's noted that the FAA actually imposes flight restrictions near the volcano. And around that same time, a large crack appears in the snow on the top. And the USFS, they closed Spirit Lake Information Center around that time, and access to the mountain above the tree line and several forest roads were all being restricted. And it was during this day that more than 25 earthquakes larger than a magnitude of 4.0 are noted to have occurred, and a hole appears at the summit near at the summit ice cap. And so at this time, around this time, hundreds of loggers, Forest Service employees, and residents are all evacuated from a good radius around the mountain and then also to accommodate, potential flooding and mud flows. Pacific Power and Light, they began to draw down 3 reservoirs on the south side of the mountain to try and hope and potentially mitigate that. And so soon, USGS officials, they issued a hazard warning to the public, to public officials, and a blast of steam and rock actually burst from the mountain with that first eruption not long after. It's been 100 years in that first eruption. And so at this point, hundreds are evacuated within a 15-mile radius of the mountain. And again, we can now see another slide that really embodies that from the Daily News. We see another image here. On March 28th, 1980, 12 more eruptions took place. And so it's just a lot of activity. And then on March 30th, 1980, 93 explosions take place in one day, and as many as 70 aircraft are seen flying around the mountain at one time, and continued, explosions open 2 craters on the summit face. And so now we see another really good image from the Daily News here that really illustrates that point. And it was on March 31st, so after all of this is happening, Cowlitz County Commissioners, they ended up just declaring a state of emergency. And it's also around the same time cabin owners, they are starting to be upset about being kept away from their retreats. And it's also around this time that the Longview Daily News quotes lodge owner Harry R. Truman saying this, that he says, "I think the whole," and I'm quoting him, "I think the whole damn thing is over-exaggerated. Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens are my life. You couldn't pull me out with a mule team." And so now we see another slide here, which shows Truman and the mountain. So on April 1st, 1980, plumes of steam and ash, they reached 20,000 feet. And scientists really start to begin to anticipate the explosion of magma from the mountain. And ongoing explosions have ended up merging the 2 smaller craters into one single crater up on the mountain. And so now we see another image from the Daily News around that time again. And then now we can see another image here, which is dated from around, we believe, April 2nd, which is again from the Daily News. And so April 3rd, 1980, the crater grew to about 1,500 feet wide and 300 feet deep, and explosions occurred just about every hour on the mountain at that time. And at this time, tourists are still continuing to come to Mount St. Helens. And according to later reports, apparently a man actually evaded the roadblocks and reached the summit of the mountain by foot. And here is another image, as this is all happening, we see another image from around that time, which is just, it's incredible. And so in the next days, scientists, they set up an observation post, Coldwater 1, and about 8.4 miles northwest of the volcano. And it's considered, the site is high enough to be safe from the largest of the expected mud flows. And, flash floods and mud flows were considered one of the greatest threats at the time from the volcano. And USGS geologist David Johnston was one of those that actually was watching the volcano at the time. And he's well known for this moment. And actually, here's again from the Daily News, we see another image of Johnston. We see an image of Johnston here. So at this time, the Washington National Guard troops are now trying to help staff the roadblock to keep people out of the area. And the crater has grown even more. It's approximately 1,700 feet long and 1,200 feet wide and 500 feet deep. And again, we see another image here from around April 6th. And then also here is another photo from the Daily News. It's and around this time that crater was growing. So on April 8th, 1980, a series of explosions lasted at least 4 hours in the morning. And this was said at the time to be the longest uninterrupted sequence of explosions to date. And it was during this time that part of a glacier actually caved into the crater, and widening the rim by more than 300 feet. And again, here we see another wonderful image from the Daily News around that same period of time. So then on April 10th, USGS geologist David Johnston, ends up setting up some or is working on, getting some gas samplings at the Timberline Park at that time. And they're just continuing to do work. And then the ground swelling and new cracks are detected on part of the northern slope. And scientists are concerned that the large mass of ice and rock could avalanche into the North Fork of the Toutle River. And so it's just continuing to grow with all this concern. And then on April 13th, 18 explosions were documented during that day. And the instruments continue to indicate a small but consistent change in the central part of the volcano. And in the early morning, as they're continuing to try to keep people out, it's noted that there were actually 3 climbers spotted near the summit. So it was just hard to keep people out of that area. And scientists, they recognized that the upper north flank of the volcano was starting to move outward, and there wasn't necessarily an agreement from some sources. They say why. And earthquakes just continued to be regular, but the number of steam plumes during this time and explosions would start to decrease. Now on April 23rd, earthquakes would continue. The tilt meter at Timberline and at Spirit Lake, they showed a slight tilting downward to the northwest. And the overall pattern suggested that the volcano might be inflating due to increased pressure from below. And so scientists would place during this time place reflector targets on the mountain to help record its movement. And then the very next day, less earthquakes were actually recorded per hour, but the average magnitudes of those earthquakes was higher. And David Johnston noted on the bulge that was starting to develop, he said, quote, "It would seem to indicate something is pushing up from beneath. The obvious speculation is that it might be magma. A major deformation like this is pretty extreme," is what he was noting at the time. And then a few days later, on April 28th, USGS illustration. There's a USGS illustration here that that talks about that northern flank starting to bulge out. And David Johnston again is quoted saying, "It's very dramatic to see this much ground in motion. It is unusual in a volcano and demands explanation. And it can't be anything but some type of dramatic change going on inside the mountain." And he added that even if the volcano quieted down at this time, he believed that an extreme danger would persist until the northern flank stabilized. And, he was quoted as saying, "Only way it can stabilize is for it to come down." And so this image here we can see again from the Daily News's timeline is regarding the movement recorded on that north flank. It's a diagram that we can see here. So May 1980, the swelling on the north face created this ominous bulge. And hundreds of earthquakes continued to shake the mountain during this time. And on May 1st, the strong earthquakes continued as scientists recorded this outward movement of about 2 feet in less than 12 hours. And then USGS established a new observatory about 5 miles north of the volcano called Coldwater Creek 2, with a trailer where the observers could stay there overnight to continue to observe what was happening with the mountain. And so May 2nd, the volcano, it continued to rumble with earthquakes, but visually, it appeared calm to a lot of people. And people were still flocking to the area during this time. And spokesmen would express this concern that people did not seem to take the danger seriously. One was quoted as saying, "One of the problems we're having is that people in the Northwest have never faced this kind of threat before, or this kind of thing before." And I feel the general public doesn't understand the danger. And so here is another slide, another image during that time when that danger was rising from May 4th. Few days later, May 7th through May 17th, there was small eruptions that continued to resume. And then more than 10,000 earthquakes would occur and the north flank grew outwards and really had this prominent bulge starting to develop. And this was strong evidence that magma really had risen high into the volcano, and steam and ash plumes about 1,300 feet high would go into the air as explosions resumed after a period of kind of quiet and break from those. And it was just this incredibly active period for the mountain. It was noticed on May 9th that the USGS, they abandoned the timberline viewpoint due to the increased danger from sudden avalanches, which had been witnessed recently as large as, about 100 feet wide and 1,000 feet long. And so it was just a really dangerous place for anyone to continue to remain during this time as the mountain grew more active. And the north flank continued to bulge outwards at about 5 feet per day around May 15th. And explosions slowed down and ceased during that time. But the continuing activity, it just continued to draw tourists, and tourists would actually congregate at the roadblocks that were put up to try to keep them away and keep them safe from the mountain. And the bulge continued to move and started to appear highly broken and distorted. And owners actually of property in what was called the red zone, they actually demanded access back to their homes during this same time. And so there was an issue with trying to do that. And on May 17th, the mountain did remain relatively quiet, with a number of earthquakes at the lowest level for the period in May, from what sources said. And the governor actually allows a few property owners in the red zone to retrieve their possessions on May 17th. And David Johnston, he takes over the duties at Coldwater 2 Observatory site, and the bulge is continuing to grow at about 5 feet per day during this time. And it's at this time that Johnston is up at the station about 5 miles north of the mountain monitoring it. And then on the morning of May 18th, just after 8:30, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake, it triggers a massive landslide of the north face, which in turn causes this lateral blast that exited the volcano roughly at just intense speed. And it's during this that 57 people lose their lives. And you say here is a photo right here of that day that we see. Some note that this was the largest landslide in recorded history, and that the lateral blast and mud flow leveled about 230 square miles of forest and caused billions of dollars in property damage. An ash plume, it reached 80,000 feet in less than 10 minutes, and the ash fallout covered about 22,000 square miles. Hot ash caused forest fires and snow melt from the top of the mountain, and this caused floods. Volcanic ash spread all across the Northwest, and more than 90,000 tons of ash had to be cleaned up from the areas around Washington State. And this 1980 eruption is the first eruption in the continental United States outside of Alaska since 1917. And it flowed north and to the west down the valley of the North Fork of the Toutle River, and Mount St. Helens erupted. It was just devastating to a huge, large area. And this, was the biggest story in Washington State for that year, definitely. And the St. Helens, eruption, it caused debris avalanches, mud flows, and it virtually obliterated everything for about an 8-mile radius. And the ash cloud, rising about 15 miles, it traveled at about 60 miles per hour and was circling the globe in about 2 weeks. And, this blast at nearly supersonic speeds, it just overtook everything. It buried Harry Truman and, about 20 or so summer homes along the North Fork of the Toutle River Valley. And within an 8-mile radius, virtually everything was obliterated. And inside this zone, Johnston, said his famous words in the transmission, Vancouver, this is it. And then he also lost his life that day when the mountain blew. And the mud flow and the volcanic debris and water began on Pine Creek, Muddy River, Swift Creek, and Kalama River, and the South Fork of the Toutle River. And I can read you all of these things and talk about all of the stuff that happened on that day. And one of the things that we did when we were initially going to do this talk is that we wanted to have a panel of journalists that experienced this event on that day. And with everything that's happening right now, obviously the moment that we're in, we were unable to be at the Kiggins Theater. We were unable to have our panelists talk, but 2 of our panelists were gracious enough to be able to do a pre-recorded interview with us that allowed us to get their view on the day and detail, from their lived account what actually happened on this day. And so first up, we're going to have Andre Stepankowsky of the Daily News in Longview. He's a 40-year veteran of the paper, and today he's the city side editor, and he was a reporter on that day that experienced that moment from Cowlitz County. And so now, without further ado, let's watch our interview with Andre and hear about his experience on that day. Okay, so we're at the 40th anniversary of Mount St. Helens, and I want to thank you for coming to talk with me today. And you work for the Daily News in Longview, and you were around at the time of the eruption, so I wanted to get your perspective. Basically, you woke up that morning. What happened?
Yeah, I'd been at the Daily News for almost a year and a half at that point. I was 24 years old. Another reporter and I, the other reporter's name was Jay McIntosh. He and I were supposed to go hiking in the Columbia River Gorge. The mountain had actually been sort of settled down a little bit. I mean, it had been rumbling and bulging 5 feet a day for almost 2 months at that point. And we thought that, well, it's safe to go out of town on a day hike. We stopped at a restaurant, it's called the Pancake House here in Longview. That actually had a view of the eruption of the volcano. And we ordered, and just as we ordered, the sky in the eastern horizon became very black. And it was apparent very quickly that something major had happened. And it was really kind of interesting because, in contrast to sort of the carnival and sort of all carnival atmosphere and the hoopla that I think had kind of accompanied the build-up to the eruption, everybody in that room knew immediately that something dreadful had happened. I mean, there was some very palpable sense of doom. That might sound melodramatic, but it was very palpable. So Jay and I finished our breakfast. I had a Spanish omelet that I'll never forget, and went down to the newspaper, which is just a few blocks away. And I called, I can't remember if it was the Forest Service or the USGS. And I asked, well, what's happened? And they said, all we know is that there's been a major earthquake. I said, you better look out your window because there's a hell of a lot more than that. We called the managing editor. We flipped a coin to see who would fly, and I won the coin toss. And so probably within an hour and 15 minutes or so, me and our staff photographer, Roger Worth, were flying to the volcano and got to it. And it was, everybody, of course, has seen Roger's iconic photo, which I thought I had it up here, of the Titanic column of ash rising from the eruption, from the mountain. And we couldn't get around to the north side of the mountain at that point because it was just too socked in. we saw several of the mud flows and several of, kind of debris avalanches kind of go down the south side, but all of that was much smaller than, of course, what happened on the north side. We were flying for about 3 hours there before we had to return to Kelso Airport because we were running low on fuel. I mean, the first story I wrote was awful because it was overwritten. We didn't really have a kind of a vocabulary to write about events like this at the time. And again, we didn't really see the damage on the north side of the mountain at that point in the day. The major mud flow that came down the North Fork of the Toutle River came down in the afternoon. And when the air cleared, everybody could see the flattened forests and how the landscape had just been absolutely ravaged by the force of the eruption. I spent part of the day writing the first story, and then a lot of the rest of my day was spent out on the river. And I was out there until well into the wee hours of the morning because we had all those mud flows and logs coming down. And there was a lot of concern there would be flooding. And the river was almost sort of like it wasn't even a river. It was really kind of more like a tub of concrete that would sort of lurch and kind of as it would rise. It wasn't a steady thing. It was just sort of kind of lurch upward every once in a while. And it was a scary thing to watch, very surreal. I can't remember how many hours I worked that first week, but it was close to 80 or 90. Worked all hours of the day. Even though you went home to sleep, you couldn't sleep because there were just too many stories to do. Our paper did 400 local stories about the eruption within the first 2 weeks. And as you know, that was part of the core of our coverage that resulted in the Pulitzer Prize that we won the following year for our coverage of the eruption. Other stories I did that week were about a family that lost a real palatial home on the Toutle River. Is one that I remember really well. Talking to residents along the Cowlitz River that night and following. I remember going out to some homes in Castle Rock that had been, they weren't just flooded, they had been knocked off their foundations, and they were all askew. And to get out there, I would climb over the roofs of several other houses and walk across boards to interview people who were salvaging stuff. And I was amazed at how patient and willing to be interviewed they were. So it was a very busy week. Of course, we had Carter come. I wasn't in on that part of the coverage, but we had newspaper people and journalists from all over the world descend on our newsroom here in Longview to help cover the story. They needed a point of operations. It was well before the internet had been invented. And so, it was much more of a traditional news production thing that we had to go through. But we got through it. We, of course, were worried that our own town was going to be inundated because there were constant rumors that there was this 200-foot wall of water that was going to be coming down the Toutle River Valley because the Spirit Lake had been dammed up, and it was concerned that blockage would breach and unleash a flood far worse than the one caused by the eruption itself. And of course, we hear today, 40 years later, still worrying about Spirit Lake. Not with the urgency and immediacy that we did then, but it's still obviously a problem. So we were doing our jobs, even though we were, we didn't know if we were going to even have a paper the next day sometime. A very interesting experience. On top of that, I was getting married a month later, and I was trying to get ready for that. And one of our wedding photos we got married in Spokane, and one of our wedding photos has us both wearing ash masks. So nothing's really changed in 40 years since now we're wearing masks again.
So in those weeks and months afterwards, obviously there was a lot you said happened on that day, and then you had all of this activity during the weeks after, and then obviously finally made not necessarily normal, but things kind of got back maybe to a normal pace, and you would have time to start processing this. How did you start to feel and process this event after you had a little time to think about it and some perspective, like right after?
Well, it took some time. We were obviously we had a tiger by the tail, and it really took probably 3 weeks or something, maybe a month before the story kind of settled down, where we can kind of sit down and figure out where do we go from here. Of course, the whole staff was involved in covering that story. We had even borrowed reporters at the time. We owned several other several other dailies in the Northwest, and we borrowed staff from them. And but it probably took again three weeks to a month before we could sit down and say, all right, where do we go from here? There were obviously stories that were going to stick with us for a long time, and are still with us, like the Spear Lake story, like the problem with the river sedimentation issue, which is still a problem that vexes us and still threatens this community. We had the issue of what's going to happen to that land. There was the big battle over the creation of the National Monument started almost while the land was still steaming from the eruption. So we started to get aboard on that. We had the whole issue of how much of this timber was going to be salvaged. We had the issue of how the rivers were going to be reopened, because if you might recall, the Columbia River was closed to shipping traffic because the mud flows had filled the navigation channel where it met the Cowlitz River, ordinarily 40 feet deep, and it had reduced it to about 13 feet in places. So all of these kind of long-term problems or issues that were clearly going to be long-term problems started to emerge and started to occupy us.
And so now, obviously it's been 4 decades, it's 40 years later, and you're talking about, this day and this event that happened and all this activity and how you felt and perceived that at that time. And then all of these longstanding issues. Now with this perspective in time, what's kind of bubbled to the surface based on your perspective? And then also what's one of those legacies you feel is still really pertinent that the community is grappling with?
I love to talk about the legacies of Mount St. Helens because there's so many of them. And I think it's appropriate that we're marking, I never say celebrate, we're marking the 40th anniversary of the eruption at the time of the coronavirus. And I think this is just another example of a reminder to us about who's in charge. I mean, here we have on one hand this enormous eruption and this enormous mountain that brought this community almost to its knees. And then on the other hand, we've got this tiny little virus that's brought the whole world to its knees. And it's a reminder of who really is in charge here. And so I think that one of the messages that I think Mount St. Helens gives is one of humility, humility in the face of uncertainty, and humility in the face of facing our future with confidence, but realizing that we're not the ones in charge, and that things could change on us, and that we have to be ready for it, and we need to take that into account. I mean, another lesson I think is that I've always been impressed with is how resilient nature is. Mm-hmm. There were plants coming up through the heavy asphalt, even just not even weeks after the eruption, and anybody who goes up there today can see the regenerative powers of nature, and appreciate the strength of the life force. And I take a lot of solace from that. A third thing that that I think is important to remember is that we often in life think of life as a beginning and an end, and then that the landscape one day will quote unquote recover. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a really good way of looking at it. We're on a journey. Life is a journey. And I think that's one of the fun ways of looking at Mount St. Helens. I mean, we look at Mount St. Helens eruption as a beginning point, but for the volcano, it wasn't a beginning point at all. It's had these events many times, not quite this big that we can tell, but it'll have others in the future. And so I think one of the joys is to enjoy the ride and realize that we're just a passenger in time here, and it's going to transcend us. It's going to transcend our moment in time, and the landscape is going to transcend its current state. And I think that's kind of fun. I think it's wrong to think of a magical point at which the landscape will be quote unquote recovered. I think it's fun to watch the process, and that's fascinating. Which leads me to kind of the fourth point is that ecological processes are so much more complex than we think. I mean, foresters like to say that the way they practice forestry in this part of the world mimics nature. But if you go up there and you watch the land come back, not one of them looks like a plantation.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? So that's kind of like, and look at the way the landscape kind of rebounds and then takes 2 steps back and then 3 steps forward, and as different species enter, it's a very complex web of life that we're really just beginning to understand. And it kind of goes back to the first point: is we need a little humility. We don't really understand it. We don't. That's the joy of it. That is the total joy of watching Mount St. Helens, is to find the unexpected and think that we understand that we're just passengers in time, and we're watching this process, and we have so much to learn from it. And finally, I think the other thing is that we've learned a lot about ourselves. The mountain gave us a pretty darn good wallop in this community, and we rebounded from it. People didn't pull up and leave. The town's still here. The ash was cleaned up. Spokane survived. Yakima survived all the ashfall. Longview survived all the mud flows that came down the river. We're still battling them. But I mean, we count too. Nature's strong. We're stronger when we're part of her and don't work against her. But we have a lot of potency too, especially when we work together. And I think that's one of the that's the last point I'll make, is that a lot of what we've been able to accomplish since in the aftermath of Mount St. Helens, like fixing our rivers, creating the monument, so on and so forth, was done out of bipartisanship. The Mount St. Helens Monument was created with bipartisan support between the governors of this state and both sides of the aisle in the Northwest congressional delegation. And we overcame the Reagan administration's reluctance to spend money on flood control here through bipartisan work of the Northwest congressional delegation. So I think that's the final thing. If we work together, we'll achieve a hell of a lot more than if we work against one another and against nature.
Yeah. Well, this was fantastic. Thank you for taking some time to talk about your experience and to, give us a perspective from Longview and also from, the daily news where you've worked at for so many years. So really, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you, Brad.
Yeah, talk to you too. All right, well, welcome all. Thank you for coming back. Again, we want to thank Andre for that really incredible interview. Andre and I have not been able to actually meet in person, and it was just incredible to be able to speak with him and that he gave his time to be able to do this and tell his experience. So our second interview is with Gregg Herrington, who was the city side editor on that day at the Columbian newspaper. And Gregg is a Clark County lifelong resident, a graduate of Clark College and the University of Washington. He was a journalist for 40 years, 7 years with the Associated Press and 35 with the Columbian newspaper in a variety of editing and writing roles. And he left the newspaper business in 2008. And then eventually he was hired on by Ed Lynch to work on the Living in Southwest Washington project in conjunction with the WSU Vancouver Digital Technology and Culture program. Gregg was subsequently was hired on as the communications director for the Battleground School District for a period of time. And now Gregg is retired. And so please enjoy the wonderful interview that Gregg provided us with about his reflections on this day. So thank you so much, Gregg, for being here and being willing to talk about your experience in relation to Mount St. Helens. So my first question is, because you were a journalist for the Columbian, is that I want to ask you, tell us a little bit about your experience on that day. You woke up on that morning and your day started. Tell us what that was like and how did you feel as the day was going on?
Sure, Brad. My job at that time was what they called city editor. Now it's called metro editor. And so I was kind of supervising coverage of various reporters and who goes where, and in working with the photo editor together. And I actually was still in bed on Sunday morning. I was awake, but hadn't gotten up yet. And the phone rang, and it was a man named Lee Rosen, one of the editors at the paper, and he had gotten word ahead of me, obviously, and called to let me know. And it's one of those things, Brad, that is shocking but not surprising. It's shocking to hear it's erupted and it's big, but it's not surprising because we were more or less expecting it. So For the life of me, I don't remember if I scarfed breakfast at home or stopped at Denny's on the way or Burgerville or went hungry, but I got down to the office quickly. And there were three people in the office, but not a lot yet. And of course, turned the TV on, started looking at the Associated Press ticker, see what they had. And obviously we knew it was huge. And I started calling reporters at home, and some of them came in without having been called. And the moment of the assignment at the moment was, my priority was, okay, where do we send reporters? We're an afternoon paper at that time. It was Sunday, and the Sunday was a morning paper, and then the next paper would be Monday afternoon. So I knew we would have all day that Sunday to gather stuff, information, pictures, and early on Monday before going to press around noon on Monday for that day's paper. So gave us some time to think about things. There was no online Columbian then. We didn't have to get something on the line right away. So that was a luxury relative to today. And so where to send reporters, and I can't remember exactly what time we all sent people, but one of the reporters, Tom Rill, went as far north as anybody, up to the Silver Lake, Castle Rock, Kelso area, and reported out of the hospitals and at the scene and so forth. That is the scene near the freeway, near I-5. But really, we're getting most of our information off of the TV initially. As the morning wore on, we sent reporters out to Amboy, Yakult, as I say, Kelso, and all over the county and into Cowlitz County. Pretty soon, Steve Small, the photo editor, came in, and he was quite concerned because one of our photographers, Reed Blackburn, had been camped overnight about 8 miles from the volcano, Coldwater Creek, camp number 2, I think it was, camp 1 or 2. And he had been there taking pictures for the Columbian and also for the U.S. Geological Survey and also for National Geographic magazine. And he had been at a camp with 2 other photographers from the USGS, or the U.S. National Geographic magazine. And those 2 guys had flown out on Saturday. They were going to go to Olympia and have dinner and spend the night, apparently, and then come back Sunday. So Reed was there alone in that camp. And that was 2 or 3 miles, as I recall, from David Johnston, who famously, he worked for the USGS, and he was at another camp, not within eyesight of Reed, but still on the north side of the mountain. And he famously is the one who said at 8:32 a.m. in the morning on Sunday, as it erupted, calling to the USGS office back in Vancouver, this is it. And those were his last words. Reed, we don't know what his last words were. Steve Small was quite agitated, tried to reach him on a radio connection, couldn't. And he tried to get into his car and drive away, and he got into the car, and that was it. The ash covered the car. We learned all this later. His body was found 4 days later. But that morning at the paper, that Sunday morning, it was kind of a gradual realization that we'd lost Reed. At first, we just couldn't contact them on the radio, and then time went on. Editor Tom Kenninger came into the paper, of course, and kept talking with Steve. They were calling other people, and that was kind of a slow death for us. It was not slow for Reed, obviously, but we gradually realized, I don't think we're going to get him back. And in the meantime, as that was sinking in, sadly, grimly, we were trying to cover the story, sending reporters out and hearing back. And I felt kind kind of a prisoner of the office. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But it wasn't until Monday afternoon, after the Monday paper came out, that I actually personally saw the mountain. My wife and I drove out to Amboy and got a good look at it. So I was strictly on watching on TV and talking to reporters for 2 days before I even got a look at the mountain. But it was just full tilt all the way. I mean, your adrenaline didn't stop going. It was absolutely high anxiety time for 2 weeks. And then when our paper came out, I don't know if you can see it, but I found my copy of that first day's paper, the Monday afternoon paper. We had a full size aerial picture on page 1. I don't know if that shows or not, Brad.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
And then all kinds of stories, a full 8 pages, nothing but volcano news and pictures by our staff, flights, and the Associated Press. Jerry Coughlin was one of our photographers that worked with Reed Blackburn, of course. And Jerry had been over at the original Pancake House in Portland having breakfast, and literally was driving back to Vancouver when he got the news, I assume on the radio. Maybe he saw it, I'm not sure, but he was coming back, and as quickly as he could, he got down to the office and spent much of the day trying to line up a plane with Steve Small, the photo editor, to get him up in the sky. And Jerry says it was about 6 at night, 6 late afternoon, plenty of daylight left in May, and before he got up and got aerial shots of the mountain. And Jerry went back again in the plane early Monday morning. So he had several pictures in the paper that day. But as I say, we had reporters, probably 6 or 8, out and about from Cowlitz County, all around Clark County, and several working in the office on the phones, and then of course the copy desk, those are the copy editors who actually lay out the paper, take the pictures, the stories, the headlines, and it was determined at some point Sunday that we're going to get 8 ad-free pages, full pages, 8 pages, starting on page 1. So there was a lot of room to do things and a lot of work for the copy desk as well. But it was a hellacious day. If it hadn't been for the deaths, certainly of Reed and others, it would have been, I could say it was even fun in a way. Big stories are fun for news people. That's why we're in the business. I mean, it's a rush, but there was nothing we would call fun about that day.
So tell me.
I'm glad I was there. If it's going to happen, I'm glad I was there.
So tell me about Reed. Give us some background. Who was he, and what did he mean to the group?
Reed was 27 years old, and doggone it, I now cannot remember where he was from. It was not from Vancouver, Clark County, but he was a quiet, witty guy. He was well liked. He could be a bit acerbic. Excellent photographer, dedicated to his craft, and to the outdoors. He had climbed Mount St. Helens multiple times with Steve Small, the photo editor, and he loved the outdoors. His widow, Faye Blackburn, is still with us, and I see her from time to time at luncheons with Columbian retirees. And but Reed was a dedicated outdoorsman and journalist, and he highly principled guy, and his work was excellent. So 57 people died that day on or as a result of the volcano, and I was looking it up, and until that day, there had been only 2 deaths in what today is the United States by volcano. One was in Hawaii and one was in Alaska. And that day we had 57 die. campers, sightseers, photographers, and so forth. And I think one of my takeaways, Brad, sort of harkens back to the virus pandemic. What the scientists say versus some who aren't taking the scientists quite as seriously as they perhaps should. But there were plenty of scientists, and David Johnston was one of them, who said this thing's going to go at some point. Don't come in. The night before on Saturday, other I'm not sure, just tourists or other scientists, people wanted to come into the blast zone, and he by radio said no, don't come in. The scientists knew it was going to go off, and just a matter of when. Obviously, they thought there would be some warning, and there wasn't. So that was obviously the tragedy of it. But my God, there were all kinds of individuals who weren't connected to science at all, camping and so forth in the area to the north, families, little children. It was a tragedy. There's no question about it. In addition, I just refreshing myself today. 7,000. The Forest Service estimated there were 7,000 big game animals, elk, deer, and bear that perished in the blast, and countless smaller animals, and of course the board feet of timber and all the other damage has been recounted several times. But just kind of refreshing it in my mind today, refreshing myself, and reading our own paper from that day. I'm kind of getting chills and anxious and just troubled by it all over again. It was, but that day it was happening so fast. There was so much to do. I think it was later before a lot of it sank into me. I mean, kind of really thought about it.
So that's one of my questions that I have for you is, often we get a lot of the accounts about that day and what was happening and everything. So you had weeks and then months to start processing this. You at the Columbian had all just lost a colleague, and so much had just happened and changed in Clark County. What were the days and weeks like after that? And how did you all feel? What was the environment at the newspaper during that time afterwards, in those days and months going on?
Well, we never lost sight of it. I mean, it was still a close story regardless. I still remember the dates of the two subsequent substantial eruptions after the May 18th. The first big one that was June 12th. And that one, unlike the original one, was blowing ash our way toward Vancouver. On May 18th, we didn't get any ash in Vancouver. We also didn't get any sound. There were people in Vancouver, BC, who heard it, and we didn't hear it in Vancouver, Washington. But when the ash did come to Vancouver, it was a very big deal. Certainly got it in house gutters. I remember cleaning ash out of our gutters, and a lot of us reporters were down at the Columbian on the night of June 12th, as I recall, and the ash was falling so hard that we didn't even want to drive our cars. So I don't know, 4 or 5, 6 of us walked over to a motel in downtown Vancouver, Travel Lodge it used to be, and spent the night there, and then walked back to the paper early the next morning because it was an afternoon paper. We didn't want to drive our cars in the ash. And then the next big one, as I recall, was not till July 18th. And as luck would have it, I was on a vacation, finally out of town on a true vacation, on the July 18th eruption, and was up in the Glacier Peak Wilderness area, north of Wenatchee, west of Chelan, on a hiking backcountry trip. And I'll never forget that sometime that day on the 18th, looking great views, looking toward the south, toward Vancouver, could actually see the eruption in the sky. And I said, it's popped again. And I wasn't there for that one. But of course, the damage was the first one. But
yeah,
But the one of the things that I remember, or that realized this morning as studying for this visit, is that on the 18th, there's so many ramifications. And here's one I'd totally forgotten about, but they closed Interstate 5 up around the Toutle River and so forth for, I'm not sure, several hours at least. And we ran a map in the Columbian the next day showing the detour. If you were going from Portland or Vancouver north to Olympia or Seattle that day after the eruption, you had to leave I-5 to get over to the coast, Pacific coast, go up, I think it was to Aberdeen, and then come back. I mean, that's a bit of a distraction. And east of the mountains was even worse. Interstate 90 was closed. Ritzville, little town of Ritzville, was hit harder than any other single town in the state. And there were several hundred motorists who had been westbound from the Spokane area or wherever, who were stranded in Ritzville, in restaurants all night, in churches and so forth, because Interstate 90 was closed. You could not drive from the Cascade Mountains to Spokane for a few days, apparently. So, and so a lot of those ramifications, Brad, really were not felt in Vancouver because of the wind blowing the ash straight east and maybe southeast a little bit, but not southwest toward Vancouver. So a lot of that stuff in Vancouver we just didn't suffer through.
Yeah. And
then when it did get ash in June 8th, June 12th, it wasn't as bad, of course, as the first ash fall.
Yeah.
But,
so, to kind of follow up a little bit, what was the atmosphere like in the newsroom for those weeks afterwards, especially with having lost Reed?
Well, it was grim. We obviously pressed on with our work. Part of it was trying to come up with new angles that we hadn't covered before. What are some of the ramifications that we haven't covered before? School closures, when will they get back open again? And then President Carter, Jimmy Carter, came to town, and I'm sorry, I don't remember how late after the 18th it was, but he was in Vancouver, so that was a big deal having a president here. Mm-hmm. And he went into the Forest Service office, which is just 3 or 4 blocks at the time from the Columbian. And then the next morning, I think it was the next morning, maybe it was the same day, they flew him around the mountain on a helicopter. And so that was big, but much of it was thinking, okay, what haven't we covered? And of course, they kept finding bodies as time went on. The first day's paper, the Monday, which was 28 hours after the eruption, our first story that day said at least 6 dead and 21 missing. Well, eventually it was 57 dead. They would find people spread out over time. So continually staying on top of that story. Where are those people? What was their story? Trying to interview the survivors about, were they camping? What were they doing? Those kinds of stories, there was plenty to do, believe me, plenty.
What did it feel like to have to speak with those survivors and try to piece together those stories? What was that like for you and everyone in the newsroom?
Well, I personally was in the office kind of as an editor, helping organize and supervise it. So I personally wasn't out the way the reporters were, tracking down family members and talking to them. That's never a fun assignment. And one of the standard operating procedures, I think, of journalists when they're having to do that and they find relatives, next of kin who don't want to talk about it, is to respect and honor their wishes and don't press it. But we will often say this to them, something like, "I understand your grief, and I'll leave you alone, but this would be one chance for you to say something about, your son, your husband, your father, and get it on the record in print. And that might be something you'd like to do. And you could do it now or call me back or not." So offering that to survivors often kind of opens a window to people saying, yeah, I would like to talk about them. Thank you. And but it's never a fun assignment. There's nothing pleasant about it.
Of course not. So now, this year marks the 40th commemoration of that event happening and everything that happened on that day. Now having all this time in perspective and all these decades past, how do you view that day and kind of your feelings in the aftermath? How does that feel 40 years later?
When I start thinking about it as I have today, and it's getting ready for this interview, it's kind of sends chills up and down me. But it's not something that haunts me at all. I didn't personally have any losses. The closest, of course, was Reed, but I mean relatives or anything like that. And so I guess I wouldn't say that I wake up every day thinking about it, but there's no question it was a huge story, and a huge part of my journalistic life. I will always say it's one of the highlights, if that's the right word, of my career in terms of covering it. So,
all right. Well, I thank you for taking the time to talk about your experience and what it was like to be a journalist at the Columbian during the time of the eruption, and also your reflections on it. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for doing this.
I would just add, Brad, that I was exceedingly proud of our staff for the coverage and the professionalism that they showed that day and throughout. Reporters, the copy editors, photographers, with support all the way from publisher Don Campbell down. It took a lot of teamwork in all departments of the paper. I don't know if you realize it, but to get the main section of the paper advertising free for 8 pages, there's a lot that goes into that. A lot of people have to be called and so forth, and the press room involved, and reporters who showed up that day without having to be called. It was clearly a team effort, and again, in a professional sense, it was one of the highlights of my career.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, and I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thanks for the Historical Society for putting this together.
Thank you. All right, so welcome back again. So I just want to thank Andre and Gregg one more time for pre-recording these interviews and sharing their knowledge. I mean, Andre is a wealth of knowledge about the impact of Mount St. Helens, and so is Gregg, and it was really incredible and humbling. Even as a historian, someone who tries to dig through material, just how much they know and their experiences from that day were just so important. So we really hope that you enjoyed that part where we were able to actually bring their experiences and their thoughts on, both the mountain back at that time and the event, and then also their thoughts about it today, because now it's been 40 years. And, that's the thing is, so decades, that have followed, there's obviously been the initial record, the newspapers. However, collections such as ours, they have been impacted by this event. And there are 2 interesting pieces in our collection at the museum that have really over the last 40 years been developed. And one is our image collection, and then our oral history. So one thing with our image collection is, as you can see here, we received a collection of photos from an individual by the name of Richard Dick Carroll. And Carroll was the director of highways for the Vancouver district at the time of the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. And this role actually offered him, access to areas that were closed to the general public. So the photos that you're going to see that I'm going to be going through in just a minute are photos that the general public couldn't see. And, this collection includes color photographs and prints taken by Mr. Carroll between April and September of 1980, as he documented the impact of the eruption on the area's roads and bridges from the ground and from the air. And so this first photo that you're seeing here, this is ash and steam rising from a minor eruption on Mount St. Helens. and on SR 504 is where he was at on milepost 38, where they said he was at. And this was on April 8th of 1980. And then this next photo, it's another one, which is the same photo or same kind of angle, same moment that's happening that we see here. And then this next photo is a clear view of ash again rising from another minor eruption. And so there was these really interesting ones, and I had never seen these ones before, and they really just were something that interested me when I started looking through these. This next one, we see a man standing in the middle. It's Lieutenant Harvey Thacker of the Washington State Patrol. He stands in a parking area of the timberline around April 11th, 1980. The next one we see, now we see destruction. We see abandoned vehicles in the ashfall on the upper Green River on May 19th, 1980. This one here we see is an aerial view of I-5 and the bridge over the Toutle River on May 19th, 1980. I think I said 1880 in the last one, sorry, 1980. Another one here, the next one is an aerial view of I-5 and the bridge over the swollen Toutle River on May 19th, 1980. This next one we see is an abandoned vehicle in an ashfall on the Upper Green River. The next one here is a burnt timberline that's from the flow. On May 18th. This one actually says it's from the day. The next one we see here is near Spirit Lake in the Harry Truman Lodge, which is filled with debris and downed timber. And this is said it's from August 29th, 1980. The next one we see here is ash on a vehicle actually at the district office in Vancouver on June 13th. So you see this old, kind of oldish car here. And this one, next one is the dredging of the Cowlitz River south of Castle Rock. So there was lots of dredging that had to happen with the river. The next one we see up close is a view of a log truck on Bailey Bridge on September 17th, 1980. And this next here is a field of downed and damaged timber from the swollen river. This next one was very interesting. You can see a bus. There's actually a bus that's buried and pinned against a half-buried tree or half-burned tree. The next slide is more down timber that was caused by the mud flow. This is said it's by milepost 26 on SR 504, May 19th, 1980. The next one is a bridge covered in dried mud and down timber over a dry lake bed. The next one is very interesting. We see a flower here. We actually see a dandelion growing up again after the Mount St. Helens eruption. The next slide is an uprooted tree with a flower blooming at the top. It's surrounded by down timber and debris. The next photo is down timber from a pyroclastic flow north of the Toutle River near milepost 28 on SR 504. And this is on May 19th. So he was able to get photos, the day after and then going forward. This next one is an aerial view of the flooding. We can just see that flooding on the Toutle River here. This next one is interesting. It's damage at the WEYCO mill on the South Fork of the Toutle River. And this is on May 28th, 1980. And then we saw the dandelion one earlier, and now we see another one where flowers growing here. We see another image again where it's growing within a mud flow. The next one here is an aerial view of a bridge above a swollen river in a muddy riverbank. This is said it's on milepost 17 on SR 504, and this is on May 19th, 1980 also. And then we have our next one, which is a hillside, which is sparse with trees completely covered in ash. We got another one, which is a mud covered vehicle wrapped around a tree. And then this next one is a side view of the I-5 bridge over the Toutle River. And then our last one, this photo is a clear view of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And those, I went through a whole bunch of photos, and there's like 200 plus of these that we were able to get into our collection thanks to Mr. Carroll's work. And you just saw just a couple of those with some of the explanations of what those were. But also we have oral histories that we have in our collection. And you actually, you can listen to our oral histories online. The Historic Preservation Commission actually administers the historic preservation grants, and we were able to digitize our oral histories. So I picked 3 out that had some quotes. So we had Arlene Garrison's oral history, which you can listen on our website. And she said this: "We were washing a motor home and weren't paying attention to anything. We didn't even know it happened. A neighbor across the street said breathlessly, 'Hey, do you know what? Mount St. Helens just blew her top. And she said, we couldn't see it from our house because they were in a place where they couldn't see it at the time, but we were kind of unconcerned about it. We didn't even realize this momentous thing was happening, that history was being made right in our own backyard. And then she says, to go on to say, my cousin called from California asking, are you all right? And so just listening to that in our collection is amazing, to hear that in her voice when she talks about this being a benign moment for her. And now Mr. Dan Ogden, who obviously is known very well, Val Ogden and Dan Ogden were very, very important to our Clark County community. And he said in his interview that the Campfire Girls had their headquarters in the Marshall House, which many of us know, and that Mount St. Helens had blown and the windows were dirty. In fact, you couldn't see out of them. And he said he got up on a ladder and had to wash the windows, which is just another incredible account that we're able to take in our oral history collection. And then the last is from Mr. Ken McCoy, which actually he sold souvenirs afterwards. And he said, and also the press coverage was covering local entrepreneurs who had seen the evolving market for souvenirs or memorable items that might be sold to visitors and viewers of the mountain. And they started to create bumper stickers, screen printed t-shirts. They were selling all along the side of the road where tourists would congregate to view the mountain. So he was talking about before. And these are just a few items that we were able to, that I was able to talk about and kind of pull that we've collected over the last 40 years in relation to the Mount St. Helens event. And obviously other things have happened. In 2004, there was the continuing activity at the mountain, and there's been many other things that have happened. In 1982, there was a national monument that was created around the mountain, and there just continued to be a lot of things. And then, for us as the museum and also as a fellow nonprofit, one of the significant moments was in the 90s when the Mount St. Helens Institute was created. And we have to give a big nod to the Mount St. Helens Institute tonight, because obviously we are treading in their ground with telling the history of Mount St. Helens as a historical museum. So we are really appreciative of what Ray provided tonight with our intro, and also just all that they do out in the community. So, as I'm wrapping up here for our talk tonight, this is an important site, and it continues to be an important site. We've collected many things over the last 40 years. There's been this activity of it becoming a monument, of the recent, the activity in 2004 through 2008, and then just the continuing passion and engagement around Mount St. Helens and the advocacy through the Mount St. Helens Institute that they continue to do. So if you have a chance during this time, all the nonprofits and all of us are working hard to continue to serve you in the way that we can. So if you can support the Mount St. Helens Institute, please do. They're an important part of our community, an important piece of continuing to remember the event that happened, and also the vibrant place that we have today up there at Mount St. Helens. And then also, because we were supposed to be at the Kiggins Theater tonight, we want to remember to help out the Kiggins. You can donate through our link that we have in the comments. And with that, we have had our chance to have another wonderful first Thursday or speaker series program here digitally to you. And I appreciate everyone who contributed to this. Wager Audio, we want to thank them for their sponsorship and all that they've done. They've been amazingly helpful and done an incredible job. We want to thank the Historic Preservation Commission. I want to thank Gregg. I want to thank Andre. I want to thank Ray, and so many others that helped us put this together and understand this story 40 years later. And so with that, I want to say thank you for watching, each and every one of you. We couldn't do this without you wanting to know this story and know these things. So thank you for watching, and have a great night.